The auditorium lights were so bright, I could see the dust floating above the stage, and for a moment, that dust was the only thing keeping me from crying in front of 600 strangers. I stood at the very end of row F, alone, in a black gown that still smelled like the dry cleaner's plastic, holding a diploma with my name embossed in gold. Vivian Marsh, Juris Doctor, summa cum laude, Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. If you had told me 4 years ago, back when I was living on ramen and grading undergrad essays for $9 an hour, that I would graduate at the very top of my class, I would have laughed. But I did it. I clawed my way there. And in that auditorium, surrounded by proud families snapping photos, holding balloons, holding flowers, holding each other, I was the only graduate standing completely by herself. My parents weren't there. My sister wasn't there. Nobody from my family had come. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're new here, welcome. This channel is where the quiet ones finally get their say, where the overlooked daughters and the forgotten sons stop staying silent. If stories like mine matter to you, hit subscribe, because trust me, this one gets so much worse before it gets better. Now, let's go back to where it all started. I grew up in a modest brick house on the north side of Cedar Falls, Ohio, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and everyone had an opinion about how you were raising your kids. My father, Dennis Marsh, worked as a regional manager for an auto parts distributor. My mother, Carol Marsh, did the books for a dentist's office 3 days a week and spent the other for managing what I can only describe as the unofficial cult of my younger sister, Paige. Paige was born 2 years after me, and from the moment she arrived, something shifted in our house. I don't say that with bitterness, not anymore, I say it as fact. Paige was blonde where I was brunette. Paige was bubbly where I was quiet. Paige cried prettily, and I cried in a way that apparently annoyed people. By the time I was 7 and she was 5, I had already learned an unspoken rule in our household. Paige's feelings were weather systems that needed to be managed, and mine were background noise that needed to be minimized. I don't think my parents ever sat down and decided to favor one daughter over the other. I think it happened the way water finds the lowest point in a yard, slowly, without any single dramatic moment, until one day you look outside, and there's a pond where there used to be grass. When I was in 3rd grade, I won the regional spelling bee. I remember standing on that stage, hands shaking, spelling the word necessary letter by letter into a microphone that was too tall for me. My parents weren't in the audience. They were at Paige's dance recital, the one where she played a background tree in the ensemble number. I found out later my mother filmed 12 minutes of the recital and 40 seconds of me holding my trophy in the school parking lot because they arrived just as everyone was leaving. "You did great, honey," my mother said that night, barely glancing at the trophy. Paige was a beautiful tree. I was 8 years old and I understood, somewhere in the back of my mind, that this was going to be the shape of my whole childhood. I just didn't know yet how deep the grooves would run. By middle school, the pattern had a name in our house, though nobody ever said it out loud. Paige needed things. Paige needed the pretty birthday party with a pony rental. Paige needed dance lessons, then modeling classes, then a confidence coach my mother found through a mommy blog. Paige needed a later bedtime because she was sensitive and got overtired easily. I needed, apparently, very little because I never asked for much, and children who don't ask for much get very little practice being given anything at all. I started working at 14, babysitting for the Hendersons 3 houses down, and by 16 I had 2 part-time jobs, one at a frozen yogurt shop and one shelving books at the library on weekends. I paid for my own school supplies. I paid for my own clothes, mostly from the clearance rack at a store 2 towns over where nobody from my high school would recognize the tags. Paige, meanwhile, had a walk-in closet full of things with tags still attached because my mother believed retail therapy was a valid response to teenage sadness, and Paige was sad a lot, in the specific, performative way that always seemed to result in a shopping trip. My father wasn't cruel. Not in the way you're picturing. He didn't yell. He didn't hit anyone. He was simply absent in the way that fathers can be absent while still technically living in the house, present at dinner but reading his phone, present at my school events, but standing near the exit checking his watch. When I made honor roll, every single semester of high school, he would nod and say, "That's my girl," in the same tone he used to acknowledge the weather. When Paige got a B- on a project because she'd tried her best, He took her out for ice cream to celebrate her effort. I want to be clear about something because I know some of you are already forming an opinion about Paige and I understand it, but I need you to understand this too. Paige did not ask to be raised this way. She was a child who was handed a crown she never earned, and there is a particular kind of damage that comes from that too, a hollowness underneath all that shine. I didn't see it back then. Back then, I only saw the crown. The moment that changed everything, the moment that I think about more than any other single day of my childhood, happened when I was 17. I had been accepted early admission to a state university with a partial academic scholarship, one of only 4 students in my graduating class of 300 to receive it. The acceptance letter came on a Tuesday in November, and I remember running into the kitchen holding it, breathless, because for one single afternoon, I let myself believe this would be the thing. This would finally be enough to make them look at me the way they looked at Paige when she won a beauty pageant runner-up sash at the county fair. My mother read the letter. She smiled. She said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart." And then she looked at the clock on the microwave and said, "We need to leave in 20 minutes. Paige has her audition for the modeling agency downtown. Have you seen my good scarf?" That was it. 20 seconds of acknowledgement, sandwiched between 2 logistics questions about my sister's modeling audition. I stood in that kitchen holding the best news of my 17-year-old life, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its finality, that nothing I ever accomplished was going to compete with Paige simply existing in a room. I want you to hold on to that kitchen scene because it is going to matter again later. Everything that follows traces back to that afternoon, to that scarf, to those 20 minutes. There's one more memory from that same year I need to tell you about because I think it explains something the kitchen scene doesn't quite capture on its own. A few months after the acceptance letter, in the spring of my senior year, I was chosen to give a short address at our school's academic awards ceremony, one of only 2 students selected out of the entire graduating class. I had practiced the speech for 2 weeks, standing in front of my bedroom mirror, timing myself, refining every sentence until it felt exactly right. I told my parents about it 3 separate times, on 3 separate occasions, because some part of me had already learned that important dates in my life had a way of slipping out of their calendar unless I repeated them like a superstition. The night before the ceremony, my mother sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where the acceptance letter had been read and set aside, and told me that she and my father wouldn't be able to make it after all. Paige had been invited to a casting call for a regional department store catalog, a real modeling opportunity. She said the kind of thing that could change everything for her, and the timing happened to overlap with the ceremony almost exactly. "You understand, don't you?" My mother said, already reaching for her keys, already halfway out the door in her mind. "This could be huge for Paige. And your speech, well, you'll do wonderfully regardless of who's in the audience. You always do." I gave that speech to an auditorium of other families, other parents beaming from folding chairs, other siblings recording proudly on shaky phone cameras. I did well. I even got a small, appreciative laugh in the right place, the kind you hope for when you've practiced a joke 14 times in a mirror. Afterward, in the parking lot, surrounded by classmates hugging their families, I called my mother to tell her how it went, and she picked up mid-sentence, already talking to someone else in the car, and said, distractedly, "That's great, honey. Listen, can I call you back? Paige just got called in early, and we're trying to find parking." I sat in my own car in that school parking lot for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive home. I didn't cry, not really. I had already by 17 developed a kind of internal scar tissue that absorbed disappointments like this without much visible reaction. But I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt almost clinical for a girl that age, that I needed to stop measuring my worth by whether they showed up, because the data was already conclusive, and continuing to run the same experiment and expect a different result was simply not something a rational person did. I didn't fully believe that thought yet. But I planted it that night in the parking lot, and it grew slowly over the following decade until it became the foundation everything else was built on. I went to college on my scholarship and worked 3 part-time jobs to cover the rest. I studied abnormal psychology, then switched to political science, then discovered during a mock trial elective my sophomore year that I had a talent for argument, for finding the crack in someone's logic and widening it until the whole structure came down. My debate coach, a sharp, No-nonsense woman named Professor Adeline Cho pulled me aside after a tournament and said, "Marsh, you have the instincts of a litigator. Don't waste them." Nobody had ever told me I had instincts for anything except being agreeable. I decided right there in that hallway outside a college debate hall that I was going to law school and I was going to be good at it and I was going to do it entirely on my own because I had already learned not to expect anyone to show up. I graduated college with honors. My parents came to that ceremony, technically, though they left before the reception because Paige had a nail appointment that couldn't be rescheduled. I took the LSAT twice, worked as a paralegal for 2 years to save money and build my application, and got into Northwestern Pritzker School of Law with a partial scholarship that covered maybe a third of the tuition. The rest, I financed through loans, through a research assistant position, through summers spent working 60-hour weeks at a downtown law firm doing document review that made my eyes ache. Paige, during those same years, dropped out of community college twice, worked briefly as a hostess, and then discovered what would become her actual calling, being an aesthetic lifestyle influencer, which, as far as I could tell, meant posting photos of herself in various states of relaxation while tagging skincare brands. My parents fully funded this. They bought her a car so she could attend brand events. They co-signed a lease on a downtown apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows because her photos needed better light. When I asked my mother, during a rare phone call, how they were affording all of this on top of their own expenses, she got defensive in a way that should have told me everything. "We're not going to apologize for supporting your sister's dream," she said. "Not everyone gets to have a fancy law degree fall into their lap, Vivian." Fall into my lap. I was working nights at a coffee shop near campus to cover my rent that semester. But I let it go, the way I always let things go, because arguing with my mother about fairness was like arguing with the wall about the weather. The wall simply does not have the capacity to understand what you're asking of it. My third year of law school, I clerked for a federal magistrate judge named Eleanor Voss, a formidable woman in her 60s who had clawed her own way up from a public defender's office in Detroit decades before it was common for women to hold her position. Judge Voss was not warm. She did not compliment easily. But 3 months into my clerkship, she called me into her chambers, closed the door, and said, "Marsh, I've had a lot of clerks. You're the sharpest one I've had in 8 years. What are your plans after graduation?" I told her I was applying to firms, mostly mid-sized litigation practices in Chicago, because the big firms felt like a fantasy reserved for people with connections I didn't have. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "I'm going to make some calls." I didn't know then what that meant. I do now. Graduation was scheduled for the second Saturday in May. I had told my parents about the date in January for months in advance, during a phone call where I could hear the television in the background the entire time. I told them again in March. I told them again in April, and that time, my mother said something that I wrote down afterward, word for word, in the Notes app on my phone, because some part of me already knew I would need to remember it exactly. "Vivian, honey, I want to be there, I really do, but Paige has this incredible opportunity that same weekend." The Cascade Wellness Resort invited her for a sponsored spa retreat, all expenses paid, and they need family there for the content. It's a whole mother-daughter self-care package they're filming for their new campaign. Do you understand how big this is for her? This could be the thing that finally gets her verified. I remember standing in my studio apartment, holding my phone, looking at a stack of law books on my desk that I had bought used, page corners already soft from someone else's studying, and asking quietly, "So you're choosing a spa day over my law school graduation?" "Don't make it sound like that," she said, her voice sharpening instantly, the way it always did when I named something plainly instead of letting her soften it into something more palatable. "It's not a competition, Vivian. You'll have plenty of graduations in your life. Paige only gets one shot at this campaign." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. You'll have plenty of graduations in your life. As if getting a law degree was a hobby you could repeat like a seasonal event. As if the years of ramen dinners and all-nighters and student loans stacking up like sediment were just a preview for some future, more important graduation that would finally be worth their time. "Okay," I said. Just that. Okay. Because I had learned, by 26 years old, that there was no version of this conversation that ended with them changing their minds, and I had stopped, mostly, wasting my breath trying. I did not tell them what I actually felt. I did not tell them that Judge Voss had already told me, quietly, that a partner at one of the most prestigious litigation firms in Chicago, Holloway and Pierce, had asked to meet me based on her recommendation, and that if the meeting went well, I would be graduating not just with honors, but with a job offer most of my classmates would spend years trying to get. I did not tell them because some small, stubborn part of me still wanted to see if they would ask. If they would show even a flicker of curiosity about what their older daughter had built. They never asked. So I went to my own graduation alone. I sat in row F in my black gown, and when they called my name, Vivian Marsh, Juris Doctor, summa cum laude, recipient of the Order of the Coif, I stood and walked across that stage by myself, and I shook the dean's hand, and I heard applause from 600 strangers who did not know me, and I looked out at the crowd out of habit, the same stupid habit I'd had since the spelling bee, scanning for two faces that were never, ever there. After the ceremony, my classmates dispersed into clusters of families, hugging, crying, holding bouquets of flowers still wrapped in cellophane. I stood off to the side near a concrete pillar, holding my diploma, feeling the particular kind of loneliness that only exists in a crowd. A photographer hired by the school was taking candid shots of graduates with their families. She noticed me standing alone and, in an act of kindness I still think about, walked over and said, "Would you like a photo? Just you and your diploma?" Some of the best photos I take are solo ones. There's something powerful about them. I said yes. I stood up straight. I held my diploma against my chest with both hands, and I did not smile the polite, performative smile I'd been giving people my whole life. I let my face be exactly what it was, tired and proud and a little bit broken, and she took the photo. I looked at that photo on my phone for a long time before I did anything with it. Then, and I want you to understand this wasn't spite, not fully, it was something closer to a final test, a last honest attempt to be seen, I opened the family group chat, the one titled Marsh Fam Love. That page had created years ago with a pink heart emoji, and I sent the photo with a single line of text. Thought you might want to see this. Love, Vivian. Then I put my phone in my bag, walked to my car alone, and drove back to my empty apartment, where I changed out of my gown, ordered myself Thai food as a small private celebration, and waited. I did not expect applause. I did not expect an apology. But some small, foolish part of me still expected something. A single heart reaction. A congratulations. Anything. What I got, 4 hours later, was a photo from my mother posted directly into the same group chat. No caption acknowledging mine at all. Just an image of Paige lounging in a white robe on a heated stone slab at Cascade Wellness Resort. Cucumber slices over her eyes. My mother beside her in a matching robe, both of them holding champagne flutes. The resort's logo tastefully visible in the corner for the sponsored content. The caption, underneath the photo, read, "Best mother-daughter day ever. Thank you at Cascade Wellness for making my baby girl feel like a queen. Hashtag sponsored, hashtag self-care, hashtag blessed." Nothing about my photo. No acknowledgement. Not even a laughing reaction that might have at least confirmed she'd seen it and simply didn't care. It was as if I had sent nothing into that chat at all, as if the entire ceremony, the years of work behind it, had simply failed to register. I sat on my couch with my phone in my lap and my cold pad thai going soggy on the coffee table, and I felt something inside me that I want to describe carefully because it wasn't rage, not yet. It was quieter than rage. It was the feeling of a very old, very heavy door finally clicking shut, somewhere deep in my chest, a door I had unconsciously been holding open for 26 years, hoping someone would eventually walk through it. That night, I didn't cry. I want to tell you that because I think it matters. I sat very still for a long time, and then I opened my laptop, and I did something I had been putting off for months out of exhaustion and a subconscious fear I hadn't wanted to name. I pulled my credit report. I want to pause here and ask you something because this is the part of the story that changes everything, and I need you to be paying close attention. If you've ever felt like the family you built your identity around might be hiding something from you, something bigger than favoritism, something that actually costs you, I want you to comment the word ready below because what I found that night still makes my hand shake a little when I think about it. I had pulled my credit report periodically since law school started, a habit drilled into me by a financial literacy elective I'd taken my first year. I always expected the usual. My law school loans, a car loan I was steadily paying down, a couple of credit cards with modest balances I kept meticulously low because I had grown up watching money be a weapon in my house, and I refused to let it become one against me. But that night, scrolling through the report on the credit bureau's website at 11 p.m., I found 3 accounts I did not recognize. The first was a business line of credit opened 14 months earlier, $28,000, under my name and social security number, through a regional bank I had never used. The second was a personal loan opened 8 months before that, $18,000, also under my name. The third was a credit card, opened just 5 months ago, with a $12,000 limit, already carrying a balance of $9,400. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the room tilt slightly around me, the way it does when your body understands something before your mind has finished processing it. $58,000 of debt, in my name, that I had never opened, never signed for, never known about. My first instinct, and I'm being honest with you here, was that it was fraud from a stranger, identity theft in the ordinary, impersonal sense, the kind you read warnings about online. I called the fraud department of the bank that had issued the business line of credit first thing the next morning, my hands actually trembling as I dialed, prepared to file a police report, prepared for the long, grinding process of proving I was a victim of some anonymous criminal. The representative, a kind-sounding man named Tobias, pulled up the account after verifying my identity and said, "Okay, Ms. Marsh, I have the application in front of me. It looks like this account was opened in person at our Cedar Falls branch. The application lists a co-applicant with authorized access. Would you like me to read you the name on file?" My stomach dropped before he even said it, because some part of me already knew, the same way you know a storm is coming from the pressure change in the air before you ever see the clouds. "Carol Marsh," he said. "Listed as co-applicant and authorized user, with power of attorney documentation attached, dated approximately 14 months ago." I asked him to repeat it. He did. Power of attorney. I had never in my life signed a power of attorney document giving my mother authority over my finances. I told him that, and he went quiet for a moment before saying, in a careful, practiced tone, "Ma'am, I'd recommend you request the full application file. If the documentation was falsified, this becomes a matter for law enforcement and likely an attorney." I already was an attorney. Freshly minted, diploma still in a manila envelope on my kitchen counter, less than 18 hours old. And in that moment, sitting alone in my apartment with a phone pressed to my ear and my mother's name echoing in a stranger's voice, I understood that the years I had spent building this specific skill set, the ability to read documents, to find the crack in a story, to build a case brick by brick until it couldn't be argued with, had not been wasted after all. They had been preparing me, all along, for exactly this moment. I requested the full application files from all 3 institutions. It took 9 days for the documents to arrive, and I spent every one of those 9 days going through the motions of my ordinary life, while feeling like I was standing very close to the edge of something enormous. I still hadn't heard a single word from my parents about the graduation photo. Not a text. Not a call. It was as though the ceremony had simply never happened, folded quietly into the part of their memory reserved for things about me that didn't matter. When the application files finally arrived, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me and read through them methodically, the way Judge Voss had trained me to read anything important, twice through for content, then a third time hunting specifically for what didn't add up. The power of attorney document was crude. Whoever had drafted it had clearly pulled a generic template off the internet, filled in my name and my mother's name, and forged a signature that looked almost, but not quite, like mine. I could tell, immediately, because my actual signature has a particular hook on the V that nobody replicates correctly, a habit from years of signing library slips as a kid, and this signature's V curved the wrong direction entirely. The business line of credit had been used to open something called Bloom and Renew Aesthetics LLC, registered 14 months earlier, the same month my mother had first pulled that power of attorney document. bloom and renew, as I discovered with a single Google search that made my chest go tight and cold, was Paige's newest venture, a boutique spa and wellness studio that had opened its doors 7 months ago in a converted storefront in downtown Cedar Falls, complete with a soft, sun-drenched Instagram aesthetic and a grand opening event that had drawn a small write-up in the local paper. My Sister's Spa. Funded, in significant part, by $58,000 of debt fraudulently opened in my name, using a forged power of attorney, while I was working nights at a coffee shop to pay my own law school tuition. I want to be very clear about what I felt reading those documents, because I think it's important, and I think some of you have felt exactly this before. It was not surprise. Somewhere in me, I think I had always known my parents were capable of taking from me without asking, because they had been doing it in smaller ways my entire life, my time, my achievements, my need for acknowledgement, all of it quietly redirected toward Paige for as long as I could remember. What I felt was something colder and more precise than surprise. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when a blurry photograph suddenly resolves into focus, and you finally see, clearly, exactly what has been standing in front of you the whole time. I did not call my mother that day. I did not call her the next day either. Instead, I did what I had been trained to do for 3 years and what my entire adult life had, apparently, been quietly preparing me for. I built a file. I contacted Detective Marisol Reyes at the Cedar Falls Police Department's Financial Crimes Division, a woman with a flat, unimpressed voice who had clearly heard every kind of family betrayal there was to hear and had stopped being shocked by any of them years ago. I gave her copies of the fraudulent applications, the forged power of attorney document, my actual signature samples from law school registration forms and bar application paperwork for comparison, and a sworn statement establishing that I had never authorized any of the 3 accounts. This is a solid file, Detective Reyes said, flipping through the printed documents on her desk while I sat across from her, still in the same blazer I'd worn to my first, and as it turned out only, meeting with the partners at Holloway and Pierce, a meeting that had gone extraordinarily well and resulted in a job offer starting that August as a litigation associate, a fact I had also not shared with my family, because, by then, I had stopped instinctively reaching for their approval the way you stop reaching for a light switch in a room you've already learned is dark. Forged power of attorney, 3 fraudulent accounts opened using your identity, clear financial benefit to a third party. This is felony identity theft and fraud, Ms. Marsh. I want you to understand, if we move forward with this, it doesn't stay quiet. Your mother will be formally investigated. I understand, I said. Take a few days, she said, not unkindly. This is your mother. I've seen people change their minds. I did take a few days. I want you to know that, because I think it's important that you understand I did not do what happened next out of blind rage. I sat with it. I thought about the kitchen and the acceptance letter and the scarf. I thought about row F, standing alone in my gown. I thought about the spa photo with no caption acknowledging mine, as though I had never sent anything at all. And at the end of those few days, I called Detective Reyes back and told her to proceed. But before the investigation became official, before any charges were filed, I decided I wanted to give my parents one chance, not out of mercy exactly, but because as an attorney, even a brand new one, I understood the value of documentation, and I wanted a clear, unambiguous record of exactly how they would respond when confronted directly. I drove the 2.5 hours back to Cedar Falls on a Thursday evening in late May, unannounced, and knocked on the door of the house I'd grown up in. My mother answered, and for just a fraction of a second, her face lit with something that almost looked like genuine warmth, the kind I had craved my entire childhood and had almost forgotten what it looked like. Vivian. What a surprise. Honey, come in, come in. I was just telling your father we should have you over for dinner soon. We've barely talked since graduation. How is it? By the way, I saw a photo somewhere. You looked lovely. I stood on the porch and did not move to come inside. You saw the photo, I said. You never said anything. Her face flickered, a small crack in the warmth, quickly papered over. Oh, sweetheart, things have just been so busy with the launch of Paige's studio. I meant to text you. I really did. You know how it gets. I know how it gets, I repeated, and something in my tone must have registered, because her smile faltered further. Is everything okay? She asked. I need to talk to you and Dad. Both of you. Now. My father appeared behind her in the hallway a moment later, drawn by the tone of my voice, wiping his hands on a dish towel, wearing the same slightly bewildered expression he'd worn at most of my major life events, as though he could never quite figure out what was expected of him. They led me into the living room, the same living room where I'd once shown them my spelling bee trophy to no reaction at all, and I sat down across from them and opened my bag. I pulled my credit report the night of my graduation. I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. I found 3 accounts open in my name that I never authorized. A business line of credit for $28,000. A personal loan for $18,000. A credit card with a $9,000 balance. All of it funding Bloom and Renew Aesthetics. Paige's Spa. The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever experienced in my life. My mother's face went through several rapid stages, confusion, then something closer to panic, quickly smoothed over into an expression of wounded defensiveness that I recognized instantly, because it was the same expression she'd worn every time I had ever pointed out an unfairness in our house. Vivian, it's not what you're making it sound like. It's exactly what it sounds like, I said. You forged a power of attorney document with my signature on it. You opened fraudulent lines of credit in my name. $58,000, Mom. While I was working a coffee shop job to pay for my own law degree. We were always going to pay it back, my father said, speaking for the first time, his voice tight. Once the studio turns a profit, we were going to transfer everything back into your sister's name. This was supposed to be temporary, Vivian, a bridge loan. Essentially, your credit was just stronger than ours, and the bank required. It was stronger than yours because I built it myself, I said. Carefully. For years. Because nobody was going to build it for me. My mother's eyes filled with tears, fast, the way they always did when a conversation stopped going the way she wanted, the same tears she had trained Paige to produce on command since childhood. You have no idea how hard it's been to watch Paige struggle to find her place while you've always just effortlessly succeeded at everything. Do you know what that does to a mother, to watch one daughter thrive and the other flounder? We were trying to help her find her footing. We didn't think it would hurt you. You have so much, Vivian. You didn't need this money. I sat very still and let that statement exist in the room for a moment because I wanted to make sure I understood it fully before I responded. You have so much. You didn't need this money. As if the years of scholarship applications and loan paperwork and midnight coffee shop shifts had been some kind of magic trick, as if my success had appeared from nowhere rather than being built, board by board, entirely without their help, and specifically because of the absence of their help. I've already filed a police report, I said. Detective Reyes at Cedar Falls PD has the forged documents, my signature samples for comparison, and a sworn statement. This is being formally investigated as identity theft and fraud. The color drained from both of their faces at once, twin expressions of shock that would have almost been funny if the moment hadn't been so devastating. You called the police on your own mother? My mother said, her voice rising into a register I recognized from every argument of my childhood, the pitch that was designed to make the other person feel monstrous for daring to hold a boundary. Vivian, I am your mother. Family doesn't do this to each other. Family doesn't forge their daughter's signature and steal her identity to fund a spa either, I said. But here we are. My father tried a different approach, quieter, more reasoning. Can we work this out privately? We can set up a payment plan. We'll pay back every cent. There's no need to involve the police, Vivian. Think about what this would do to your sister's reputation, to the studio, to this family's name in this town. And there it was. The exact same math that had governed my entire childhood, laid bare in a single sentence. Think about what this would do to your sister. Not, think about what we did to you. Not, we're sorry. Just an immediate, reflexive pivot to protecting Paige's image. Even now, even standing in the wreckage of what they'd done. I have thought about it, I said, standing up. I thought about it for 9 days before I came here. I'm not doing this out of anger. I'm doing this because I spent my entire life being told that my achievements didn't matter as much as Paige's feelings, and I let that go, again and again, because I thought eventually it would even out. It never evened out. It just kept costing me more. I left the house that evening with my mother sobbing on the porch behind me and my father calling my name in a voice I'd rarely heard him use. something that almost resembled desperation. I did not turn around. I want to tell you about one more thing that happened before the police report became official because I think it matters and because it's the moment I understood just how far my family was willing to go to protect the version of events where they were never the villains. 2 days after that confrontation on the porch, my mother invited the extended family to a small celebratory dinner at the country club just outside Cedar Falls, ostensibly to mark the 6-month anniversary of Bloom and Renew's grand opening, though I suspect, looking back, it was really meant to be a preemptive strike, a way of publicly cementing the narrative of a thriving family business before any rumors of fraud could take root. I was invited too, which surprised me, until I understood the reason. My mother wanted an audience present when she tried, one more time, to talk me out of what I'd started. I almost didn't go. But Detective Reyes, when I mentioned the invitation during a follow-up call about the case timeline, said something that changed my mind. If they're planning to pressure you in front of family, that's useful for us too. People say things in front of witnesses they'd never put in writing. Just don't let them corner you into promising anything. So I went. I sat at a long table in a private dining room decorated with soft string lights and a banner that read, "Cheers to 6 months of Bloom and Renew," surrounded by aunts and uncles and my grandmother, all of whom, I quickly realized, had no idea what was actually happening beneath the surface of that celebration. My mother had not told them about the fraud. She had told them, instead, a much simpler story, that Vivian was going through something and had been distant lately. The vague, sympathetic language families use when they want an audience to feel sorry for the person they've actually wronged. Halfway through the appetizer course, my Aunt Denise, my mother's younger sister, leaned toward me and said, not unkindly, "Your mother says you've been under a lot of stress since the bar exam. Everything okay, sweetheart? You know, you could learn a thing or two from your sister about not letting work consume you like this." I looked at her for a long moment, and then, very calmly, I said, "Actually, Aunt Denise, I've been under a lot of stress because my mother forged my signature and stole $58,000 in my name to fund Paige's spa. I've filed a police report. There's an active investigation." The table went silent in a way I have never experienced before or since, silverware frozen midair. My grandmother's fork suspended over her salad. My uncle's wineglass paused halfway to his lips. My mother's face went the color of the tablecloth. "Vivian," she hissed, leaning across the table, her voice a strained whisper. "Not here. Not like this." "You wanted an audience," I said, still calm, still steady, the same voice I would later use in a courtroom. "I'm just giving you one." Paige, sitting 3 seats down in a pale green dress that matched the spa's branding, went white and pushed her chair back slightly, as if putting distance between herself and the words hanging in the air might somehow undo them. "Mom," she said, her voice small, "is that true?" My mother did not answer her. She simply sat there, her hands trembling slightly on the white tablecloth, while 8 family members who had known her for decades looked at her with an expression I had never seen directed at her before. Doubt. My grandmother, 81 years old and sharper than anyone in that room gave her credit for, set down her fork with deliberate slowness and said, into the silence, "Carol, is this true?" My mother's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. It was going to be temporary, she finally said, her voice cracking. I was going to fix it before it ever became a problem for her. "You stole from your own daughter," my grandmother said, and her voice, though quiet, carried a weight that silenced the entire table completely. "To give to the other one. Again." That phrase, "again," hung in the air longer than anything else said that night because it confirmed something I had always suspected but never heard spoken aloud by anyone else in my family. That other people had noticed the pattern too for years and simply never said anything, the way families often let injustice continue simply because naming it feels more disruptive than living with it. I did not stay for dessert. I stood, thanked my grandmother quietly for asking the question no one else would, and left the country club while my mother's voice rose behind me in a mixture of pleading and anger, the two things that had always, in my family, arrived at exactly the same volume. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you something. Do you think Vivian was too harsh, Calling the police on her own mother? Or do you think $58,000 of fraud earns exactly this response? Drop your honest answer below, because the next part of the story is going to make that question a lot more complicated. The investigation moved faster than I expected, largely because the forged power of attorney document was so poorly executed that a forensic document examiner confirmed the signature discrepancy within 2 weeks. Detective Reyes called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at my desk at Holloway and Pierce, 3 weeks into my new job, drafting a motion for a completely unrelated commercial litigation case, and told me that formal charges were being filed against my mother: felony identity theft, financial exploitation, and forgery. Your father isn't being charged, she added. The account applications all show your mother's signature as the applicant. He'll likely be interviewed as a witness, but right now, this points to her. I felt a strange, hollow relief at that, though I want to be honest with you. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe some part of me still wanted to believe my father was less complicit, even though I knew, deep down, that he had known exactly what was happening and had simply let it happen, the same way he had let every unfair thing in our house happen for 26 years, by looking away and calling it peace. News travels fast in a town like Cedar Falls, and it travels faster when the person under investigation is the mother of a mildly locally famous spa owner whose grand opening had been covered in the town paper 7 months earlier, with a headline calling her Cedar Falls' newest wellness visionary. Within a month, whispers had turned into open conversation at the grocery store, at church, at the same nail salon my mother had frequented for a decade. I heard about this secondhand from an old high school friend named Marnie, who still lived in town, and reached out to check on me, saying she'd heard some crazy rumor about my mother and wanted to know if it was true. I told her it was true. I didn't elaborate. I let the story move at its own pace through the town, the way stories do, gathering detail and distortion as they traveled, because I had learned by then that trying to control a narrative once it left your hands was a losing game, and my energy was better spent building my actual case and my actual career. Paige called me for the first time in nearly 2 months on a Sunday evening in July. I almost didn't answer, but some old, worn-down instinct made me pick up. "Vivian, please, you have to drop this," she said immediately, no greeting, her voice shaking in a way I recognized from childhood, the specific pitch of Paige realizing that something bad was happening to her and reflexively looking for someone else to fix it. "Mom is a wreck. She hasn't slept in weeks. Do you understand what this is doing to her? To me? People are canceling their bookings at the studio because of the rumors. Vivian, I could lose everything." "I understand exactly what it's doing," I said, keeping my voice level, because I lived it for 26 years before either of you noticed. "That is not fair," Paige said, and I heard the particular crack in her voice that used to make our mother drop everything and run to come for her, the crack I now recognized, with a kind of cold clarity, as a tool rather than a genuine expression of feeling. "I didn't ask Mom to open those accounts. I didn't even know until she told me last week. I swear to you, I had no idea. Please, Vivian, you have to believe me." I want to tell you that I believed her completely, but the truth is more complicated than that, the way most truths about families are. I do believe Paige didn't personally forge my signature or draft the falsified power of attorney. But I also know, because I lived in that house for 18 years, that Paige had spent her entire life benefiting from a system specifically designed to extract resources from me and redirect them to her, and at some point, benefiting from a system without questioning it becomes its own kind of complicity. "Did you ever wonder," I asked her, "how a spa with your track record got a $28,000 business line of credit? Did you ever ask Mom where that money came from?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I didn't want to ask too many questions. Paige finally said, quietly, "I was just so relieved someone finally believed in my dream." "Someone did believe in a dream," I said. "It just wasn't Mom's money funding it. It was mine. Stolen. Without my knowledge or consent." She started crying then, the real kind, I think, not the performative kind, and for a moment I felt something soften in me, the old reflex to comfort her, the muscle memory of 26 years of being the one who managed everyone else's feelings while mine went unattended. I let the silence sit for a while before I spoke again. "Paige, I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because what happened to me was a crime, and crimes have consequences, and for the first time in my life, I'm allowing the consequences to actually land where they belong instead of absorbing them myself. I hope the studio survives this. I really do. But it's not going to survive it by using my identity as collateral, and it was never going to be sustainable, if that's the foundation it was built on. She hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat on my couch for a long time afterward, feeling something I can only describe as grief mixed with an almost frightening sense of relief. The criminal case moved through the system over the following months with the particular grinding slowness of the American legal system, something I now understood intimately from the other side of the profession. My mother's attorney, a local Cedar Falls lawyer named Gerald Timms, who mostly handled property disputes and the occasional DUI, attempted several times to negotiate a quiet settlement, offering restitution in exchange for dropped charges. Detective Reyes and the district attorney's office declined each time, in part because the forgery was so clearly documented, and in part, I suspect, because financial crimes against family members had become something of a personal cause for the assistant DA handling the case, a woman named Priya Natarajan, who told me privately, over coffee one afternoon while preparing my testimony, that she saw an alarming number of cases exactly like mine, and rarely got the chance to prosecute one where the victim was as prepared and as clear-eyed as I was. Most victims in these cases minimize it, she told me. They love their parents. They don't want to see them go to prison. They drop charges halfway through. You didn't waver once. Can I ask why? I thought about it for a long moment before answering. Because I spent my whole life being told my feelings were less important than my sister's, I said. I decided this was going to be the one time they mattered more than everyone else's comfort. The trial itself was mercifully brief, since my mother's attorney eventually advised her to plead guilty to a reduced charge in exchange for a lighter sentence, given the overwhelming strength of the evidence, the poorly forged signature, the bank's internal application records, my own meticulously documented credit report history establishing exactly when the fraudulent accounts appeared. She was sentenced to 18 months, with the possibility of parole after 9, plus a restitution order requiring her to repay the full $58,000, with interest, directly to me. I was in the courtroom for the sentencing. My father sat 2 rows behind me, alone, since Paige had chosen not to attend. Something I later learned was because she couldn't bear to be photographed near the courthouse given the local press attention the case had drawn by then. A small, sharp local news story with a headline, Cedar Falls mother charged with defrauding her own daughter to fund sister's spa business. A headline that, I confess, gave me a complicated, uncomfortable satisfaction I'm still working through even now. My mother did not look at me during the sentencing. She stared straight ahead, her shoulders rigid, and when the judge read the sentence aloud, she made a small sound, not quite a sob, more like the air leaving a body all at once. I felt many things watching her in that moment, a flicker of something that might have been pity, a colder, steadier current of vindication, and underneath both of those, a strange, quiet grief for the mother I had always wished she could be and never actually was. After the sentencing, my father approached me in the courthouse hallway, his face gray, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets like he didn't know what else to do with them.
"Vivian," he said.
"I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything, but I need you to know I didn't know how bad it had gotten. I knew about the accounts, eventually, but I told myself it was temporary, that we'd fix it before it ever became your problem. I should have stopped it the moment I found out. I didn't because I've spent so many years just letting your mother handle things, and I think somewhere along the way, I stopped asking hard questions about what handling things actually meant." "You knew," I said, "and you let it happen. The same way you let everything happen my whole life. That's not an accident, Dad. That's a pattern."
He didn't argue with me.
He just nodded slowly, his eyes wet, and said, "I know." I left him standing in that hallway and drove back to Chicago that night, back to my apartment, back to the life I had built entirely from my own 2 hands, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the drive felt light instead of heavy, like something enormous had finally been set down after being carried for 26 years. The spa did not survive the scandal, not fully. Bloom and Renew Aesthetics lost roughly 60% of its client base within 2 months of the story breaking, largely because half the town had known my family for decades and could not separate the business from the fraud that had funded it. Page attempted to rebrand, changing the name, running a social media campaign about resilience, and starting over, but the damage to the local reputation was done, and 6 months later, she quietly closed the studio and moved to Columbus, where, according to the same friend Marnie who still occasionally updated me, she was working as a receptionist at a different spa, one she did not own. Marnie told me, a few months after the closure, that Paige had tried one more time to relaunch under yet another name, something called Stillwater Studio, using a small business loan she'd applied for herself this time, in her own name, with her own credit, which, it turned out, could not qualify her for anywhere near the amount she needed on her own merits. The loan officer, according to a story that had made its way around town with a particular relish small towns reserve for a fall from grace, had apparently asked Paige directly whether she had any family members willing to co-sign, and Paige, for the first time in her adult life, had no one left willing to put their name behind hers. I do not take pleasure in that outcome exactly, though I won't pretend there isn't some part of me that recognizes a certain rough justice in it. What I feel more than anything, when I let myself sit with it honestly, is a sense of finally being free from a story that was never really about fairness to begin with. It was about a family that had decided, long before I was old enough to have any say in it, that my role was to give and Paige's role was to receive, and the fraud, in the end, was simply the most literal, most legally actionable version of a pattern that had been running underneath our entire lives for 26 years. I received the restitution payments, court-ordered, deducted directly from wages my mother earned during a work release program in the final months of her sentence. I did not spend that money frivolously. I put it, every cent, into an account I opened specifically for it, and eventually used it as a down payment on a small condo near the Chicago River, the first home I've ever owned that no one else's name is on, no one else's approval attached to it, nothing tied to anyone's expectations but my own. I made partner track at Holloway and Pierce within 2 years, faster than almost anyone in the firm's recent history, something Judge Voss, who I still speak with regularly, tells me she is not remotely surprised by. I had lunch with Judge Voss about a year after the sentencing, in a small diner near her chambers that she insisted made the only decent coffee within walking distance. She asked me, over eggs and toast, whether I regretted any part of what I'd done, whether some quieter, less public resolution might have sat easier with me in the long run. I told her the truth, which was that I had turned that question over more times than I could count, lying awake some nights running through every alternate version of events, the version where I quietly asked for repayment and let it stay a private family matter, the version where I never pulled my credit report at all, and simply let the ceremony of that graduation day be the last word. I told her that none of those versions felt like justice to me. They felt like the same old arrangement wearing a slightly different coat, the one where I absorbed the cost of someone else's choices and called it keeping the peace. You know what I think, Judge Voss said, stirring her coffee slowly, is that most people spend their whole lives being trained to believe that dignity and forgiveness have to arrive together, on the same schedule or not at all. You figured out you could have one without rushing the other. That's rarer than you'd think, even among lawyers. I think about that lunch often, especially on the harder days, the days when a client's case reminds me too closely of my own, when I have to excuse myself from a deposition for 5 minutes to steady my breathing before walking back in and finishing the job. I specialize somewhat pointedly in financial fraud litigation now, representing victims of exactly the kind of theft that was once done to me, and there is a particular, quiet satisfaction in sitting across from a client who has been betrayed by someone they trusted and being able to say, honestly, I understand exactly what this feels like, and I am going to help you build the case that finally makes someone answer for it. My mother was released after 11 months on parole. She reached out once, about 4 months after her release, through a letter, not a text or a call, a physical letter that arrived at my office because she didn't have my new home address. I still have it. I keep it in a drawer, not because I read it often, but because I think it's important to remember exactly what it said. Vivian, it read, I hope someday you can find it in your heart to forgive me. I made mistakes, but everything I did came from love. I only ever wanted what was best for this family. I hope one day we can be a family again. My father called me once, about 6 months after my mother's release, on a Sunday afternoon while I was grocery shopping in my new neighborhood, a call I almost let go to voicemail out of habit before something made me answer. He didn't ask me to forgive anyone. He didn't ask me to come home. He simply said, "I watched you argue that fraud case on the local news last week. The one with the widow. You were good, Vivian. Really good. I don't think I ever told you that about anything you did growing up, and I've been sitting with that for a long time now." I stood in the cereal aisle holding a basket, not entirely sure what to say, because it was such a strange, small thing to receive after 26 years of silence, and yet it landed harder than I expected it to. "Thank you," I said, finally, because it seemed like the only honest response available to me. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I just wanted you to hear it from me, out loud once." We talked for a few more minutes after that, careful, brief, neither of us reaching for more than the conversation could hold. It was a reconciliation, not really, but it was the first time in my entire life that my father had said something to me without immediately attaching a comparison to my sister, without a but or a meanwhile or a and Paige, and I have held on to that small, unqualified sentence more tightly than I expected to. I have not responded to my mother's letter. I don't know if I ever will. I think about it sometimes, the phrase "everything I did came from love," and I turn it over in my mind the way you'd turn over a stone looking for what's underneath it. I don't think my mother is lying when she says that. I think she genuinely believes love and control were the same thing in her mind, that loving Paige meant giving her everything and loving me meant expecting me to need nothing, and I think that belief cost both of her daughters more than she will ever fully understand. Last month, I stood in front of a jury for the first time as lead counsel on a case, representing an elderly widow whose son-in-law had drained her retirement accounts over 3 years using forged documents disturbingly similar to the ones that had once been used against me. I won that case. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach their verdict. Afterward, my client hugged me in the courthouse hallway and said, through tears, "You made me feel like what happened to me actually mattered." I think about my graduation photo sometimes, the one I sent into that group chat that got no response at all, the one that sat quietly beside a sponsored spa photo captioned "Best Mother-Daughter Day Ever," as though I had never existed in that family at all. I think about how much that silence hurt in the moment, and how completely different it feels now, looking back, knowing everything that silence eventually led to. I don't send photos into that group chat anymore. I left it actually about a year ago, a small, quiet act that felt bigger than it should have. Paige texts me occasionally, usually late at night, usually vague, checking in without ever quite apologizing for anything specific. I respond sometimes, briefly, politely, the way you might respond to an old acquaintance you don't dislike, but no longer feel any particular pull toward. I built the life, in the end, entirely out of the parts of myself that nobody else ever seemed interested in developing. The stubbornness that used to be called difficult, I now use in a courtroom. The independence that used to be treated as a lack of need, I now recognize as the single most valuable thing anyone ever accidentally taught me. I think, if I'm honest, that my parents gave me something after all, though it certainly wasn't what they intended. They gave me 26 years of practice standing entirely on my own, and it turns out that was exactly the skill I needed to build the life I actually wanted. A few weeks ago, I was cleaning out an old box of law school materials and found the photo from that graduation day, printed and tucked inside a folder I'd forgotten about, the one the kind photographer had taken of me alone, diploma held against my chest, standing perfectly straight in that black gown. I looked at it for a long time. The woman in that photo looks tired. She looks a little lost, but she also looks like someone who is still standing, still showing up for herself, even when no one else did. I had that photo framed. It sits on the bookshelf in my office now, right next to my bar admission certificate, where I see it every single day when I sit down at my desk. Not as a wound anymore, as proof. Proof that I walked across that stage entirely on my own power, and that everything I've built since then, I built the exact same way. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I think about the version of me who sent that photo into the family group chat, the one who is still, in some small, stubborn corner of her heart, hoping for a single word back. I don't feel embarrassed for her anymore, the way I did for a while, in the rawest months right after everything came out. I think she was doing something braver than she realized at the time. She was giving her family one last honest chance to show up cleanly without asking for anything in return, and when they didn't, she didn't collapse. She went home, and instead of waiting for someone else to notice what she'd built, she opened her laptop and started building the next thing entirely on her own. I think that's the part of the story I most want you to take with you, more than the fraud, more than the courtroom, more than the sentence or the restitution or the closed spa. Somewhere along the way, I stopped needing the photo to mean something to anyone but me. And once that happened, once I really believed it, nothing they did or didn't do could touch me the same way again. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to build your own graduation stage out of nothing, comment, I walked alone too below, so I know I'm not the only one, and I'll see you in the next story.